Well, we're still working on the coaling tower. This week we're working on ladders and bolts.
Oh, sounds like a game for kids.
I never thought of it that way. It could be an interesting...
It would be like chutes and ladders, emphasis on shoot.
What we've been doing up to this point, well, last week we were rigging the coal buckets and the cabling system that runs the coal buckets. And now that that's all in place, we can put the ladders in. Because these cables, the way they sit in there, the ladders and the braces all work in around the cables. And so until these cables and pulleys and everything were in place, really couldn't do anything with the ladders or any of the wood bracing or anything like that. These ladders, every time I look at them, my blood just about runs cold.
Oh, no kidding.
I have a problem with heights, and I have a problem with ladders. That is to say, I have a problem with building ladders.
Yeah, it's a little difficult.
There's a trick to it, and we'll be covering exactly how that works. Look at the ladders on the prototype.
Yeah, I look at that and I just want to pass out.
This is actually the coaling tower that was at Durango. They tore it down before it fell down. But it has a very similar ladder system to the coaling tower at Chama, which is the one that we're basing the ladder system here on. But these run back and forth in a slightly different direction, and the bracing on this tower was slightly different as well. Of the various coaling towers on the Rio Grande, I don't think any two of them are the same.
No.
Now check this out. This was the coaling tower at Gunnison.
Ah.
I maybe OSHA stopped in.
Maybe somebody just had some common sense.
I just think whoever the yard manager was, said, if I'm going up there, we're doing it different.
Bad knees, maybe.
Look at that. There's even railings and a platform around the sound tower.
I like it.
Somebody was thinking ahead because they didn't want to fall off of there. So anyway, ours is going to have the scary ladder system. So the first thing that needs to happen is these beams here need to be extended. The lower part of that extension I knew had to be added, and it will be supported by another beam. For now it just kind of floats there. But that little upper part is because I screwed up and I made these beams a little too short, so I have to extend them. Then this center section needs to be added. The cross member in there locks the vertical beams in place that have the tracks on them that hold the coal buckets. And I haven't been able to put this on here so that I can get the coal buckets in and out of the track. Now that the coal buckets are in the track, I can place this horizontal beam between the two uprights, and that will lock the tracks in place so the coal buckets cannot be removed from the track. And they can't just fall out on their own. Then there are these two planks that go in here. These are frighteningly enough, these are the actual walkways that people have to go on when they're climbing the ladders. The lower one is just a second plank that makes two 10-inch planks, making for a 20-inch shelf across there for someone to walk on. The upper one butts up against that heavy beam and forms the only available walkway through there. And then these two large beams set on top of those horizontal beams and are bolted in place to strengthen the entire structure. This is why I had to add those little extensions to the other horizontal beams, because this has to sit on top of those center beams, and so that beam needs to extend further out. Now there are 4 of these huge beams that support the tracks for the coal buckets, and the outer 2 have to be doubled up in order to support these beams that I just put on there. That's why I said earlier that they're just going to be sort of floating in place for now. They're actually going to be supported now by these beams that are doubled up along those vertical support columns. Now there's the walkway and railing.
Wow.
You can call it a walkway and you can call it a railing. if I made it to the top of this first ladder, I think that's as far as I would ever get.
Oh, no kidding.
That's just, and then look, you have to step across onto that heavy beam while grabbing a hold of the ladder to start up the next ladder.
Right. The going up's one thing. Coming down, I think I'd just go all the way down that fast.
Yeah, I'd want somebody to spot me or something. So the way that I constructed the ladders is I took these square elements that are going to be the outer parts of the ladders and fit those in place so that they fit snugly up against the horizontal beams, cutting those at an angle on my chopper to get them to fit exactly right. Once I had those shaped exactly the way I wanted them, I glued in place the very top and bottom rungs so that I could test fit the whole thing to make sure it was going to work before adding in all of the additional rungs going up the ladder. I know it seems a little less than American, shall we say, but when I'm doing this kind of thing, I always use the metric system. I use a lot of metric just in my modeling because it's so much simpler. At any rate, I have here 13 centimeters that need to be equally divided into rungs. Turns out that if I space them 15 millimeters apart, it works out perfectly if I add 7 in here. So I added 7 new rungs 15 millimeters apart. Then I test fit the whole thing, make sure it was going to fit. I'm not going to glue anything in place until it's stained. So everything's just kind of sitting in here at this point, at least in terms of the ladders. The beams are already glued in place and I'll stain them in place. Okay, on to the next ladder. This one's really scary. This is a really tall ladder and it takes you up to about 65 feet up in the air. Anyway, next ladder, same exact process. Cut and fit the 2 outer rails that hold the rungs. In this case, they're different lengths because one sits up on the walkway and one sits down on the beam, so that all has to be fit. And then glue in place the top and bottom rungs for the ladder so that the whole thing becomes an assembly and I can double check the fit before adding all the intermediate rungs. Little bit of simple math tells me that I need to add 13 intermediate rungs. The spacing here is a little closer together than the previous ladder, but I want, of course, the spacing to work out equally, and so that's what looks best. So they're a little tiny bit closer than the lower ladder. Now, at the top of that ladder is the pulley deck for servicing these intermediate pulleys. This is nice for somebody coming up here because now they have an actual little bit of floor to stand on. No railing, but at least they have some floor that they can stand on while servicing these pulleys. And now the very top ladder that goes up from the pulley deck into the pulley house at the top. Now we're about 85 feet up in the air, and this is getting really scary. And at the very top of this ladder, there's a door that has to be opened in order to enter the pulley house. I've already modeled the inside of the door, but I wanted to get the ladder in place before adding the outside part of the door because I wasn't quite sure where the ladder was going to sit and so on. So this way I can come back and add the door now that the ladder is in place. These 3 ladders are the only ones that are glued in place because they're back in here behind the cross bracing and so on. The other 2 ladders are removable because they need to be set aside whenever I have to lift the building off of the railroad, which hopefully isn't very often. The bottom 2 ladders were constructed using the exact same technique. And then, as I say, these are just setting in place. But I still needed to cut the tops and bottoms at a bevel so that they fit correctly. In going through old photographs, I could see where at times there was a ladder on either side of this walkway up to the coal chute. More often than not, there was only one ladder. And today, well, there are no ladders because they don't want anybody climbing up there and getting hurt. So they have an aluminum ladder, an extension ladder inside the building, and they just bring that out whenever they're going to do a demonstration. Doesn't fit really well, and they have to be careful because the whole thing wants to just tip over.
I think he was just testing it.
And then there's some shiny places from the glue, and mostly a lot of places where the stain didn't take. And I'm going to come in here with a little acrylic and just put some acrylic color over the top of that to hide the imperfections. And then, like I say, the final thing will be a final bit of weathering over the whole thing with some dry brushing. As per the rest of the building, and for that matter, most of the wood structures like the trestle here on the railroad, I'm using Watco Danish wood oil, a combination of the two colors, black walnut and just the natural. That way I can get some variegation in the color. And then typically I'll come back and dry brush some gray tint over the top of the whole thing, some dark washes and some gray dry brushing just to give it a more weathered appearance. So that'll be the last thing I do here. And now I can glue these ladders in place. I'm using thin CA, and you can see it wants to go all over the place. I'm using one of these little squeeze bottles with the metal tube, which I like to do. I showed this technique on Tuesday, and a lot of people commented some other ideas, like especially using a sewing needle to do this. I'm going to try that. That sounds like a really great idea, to use the eye and a sewing needle and even grind away the very end so it forms sort of a fork, and you can get a little drop of glue in there and place it right where you want it.
Running our government. And it is our job to make that abundantly clear every single day. And if you want to support that, as always, you can hit that subscribe button, leave a like on this video, and if you stuck around in the end, you can drop a little mark in the comments. And until next time, I'll see you soon.
Well, that's looking really great. I mean, I think it looks really real, to be honest.
And you know, as I work on a model, it hits a certain point and you go, oh my. Mm-hmm. It's actually starting to really come together. You find yourself just taking a few steps back and looking at it going, whoa, wait a minute, this is really enjoyable to just sit here and look at this.
Exactly.
One of the things I like about working with these wood stains, I still like to come back in, of course, and do a little bit of weathering, but I like the, dare I say, furniture kind of look.
Exactly.
The stained wood, and it just has a rich look to it. And I don't always want to cover that up with a lot of weathering and that sort of thing. I like the look of it.
I do too.
Okay, now that the ladders are in place, I can put the cross bracing in place here. I wasn't able to do any of this cross bracing because I need access back in there in order to get my ladders and cables and whatnot in. So now I can finally put the cross bracing on. I'm cutting the cross bracing with a Northwest short line chopper. Karen and I use these things. They're just so amazing when you need to cut angles and cut strip wood and plastic and that sort of thing. At any rate, I used that to cut the proper angles onto the cross bracing and started putting all that in place. Oddly enough, all of the different coaling towers on the Rio Grande used a slightly different pattern in their cross bracing, just kind of different. From what I can tell from the old photographs, only Chama had cross bracing here on the very top section. Again, no idea why they would put different kinds of cross bracing on every single tower. Maybe it has something to do with I don't even know. Anyway, you can see why I had to hold off on the cross bracing until the cables and the ladders were in place. There'd be no way to get to any of that stuff at this point. The cables run right up through the cross bracing, and the ladders are way back behind everything. And now these great, big, huge, heavy vertical beams that hold the horizontal beams on a lot of the tower in place. And this is exactly how they work on the prototype. They're stacked up like this in 3 sections. At any rate, those set up against the main beams, and then they're bolted in place with huge bolts. I'm going to go ahead and stain those things before I glue them in place, and then ultimately I'll put some nut bolt and washer castings, great big huge ones, on there to simulate the way these are bolted to the other beam. I'm gluing them in place with white glue and then clamping them so that I get a good glue joint there. I used a different wood. It's a red cedar on a lot of this. There's several different kinds of wood. Anyway, this is a white pine of some kind on there, and it didn't take the stain in quite the same way. But again, ultimately everything's going to get some dry brush weathering, and that should bring everything into a similar look. And now the aforementioned nut, bolt, and washer castings. I buy a lot of these from Ozark Miniatures, Dave Roten at Ozark Miniatures. Plus we cast a whole bunch of different ones and have them here in the shop. I like to keep bins and bins full of these things because we really go through them. And it's always nice to have 1,000 or so of these things on hand in different sizes. They all have a nut, bolt, and washer on the head of them, and then a long shaft so that you can just drill a small hole and stick the little shaft into the hole and glue it in place. Really simple. There's also a hand grab right at the top of the first ladder to transition from that ladder up onto the tower. We've got lots of these around as well. Of course, they're used on freight cars. And so I'm just going to go ahead and install the hand grab here at the top of the very first ladder. So very simple, just simply mark out where the two holes need to be drilled, and then using a pin vise, drill very small holes in here to stick the two studs in there for the hand grab, and then glue those in place. I just used a CA glue for that. And now I went through and drilled somewhat larger holes in the places where these larger nut, bolt, and washer castings need to go. They're not all the same size, and so these are the particularly large ones, anywhere there's a really heavy beam and a bolt that would extend through a substantial amount of wood, a very long bolt. I'm using these much larger ones. And of course I use these for those very large stacked beams that I just added to the outside of the main beams that support the tracks. And now there's something like, 100 of these smaller nut, bolt, and washer castings that bolt the entire framework of the tower together. When I was dragging the coal buckets up and down the track, it sort of scraped the paint off the track in places, and I really like the look of that. And it kind of works together nicely with the nut, bolt, and washer castings to provide all these little exposed areas of bare metal. I'm using 2 of the small nut, bolt, and washer castings for each section of the cross bracing. Of course, this wouldn't work with just a single bolt on the prototype. The whole thing would warp like crazy. So I'm putting 2 of these at each end of the cross bracing. I'm doing the back and both sides, as those are actually completely finished now in terms of their wood. I still have a lot of wood to do on the front of the tower, so I'm not going to address any of the nut, bolt, and washer castings on the front until I get the whole front dialed in.
Well, I like the look of them just in the silver color.
Yeah, and normally I would be tempted to sort of put some rust or something on there. But even looking at the prototype pictures, the real ones have a lot of just silver showing. Mm-hmm. So I'm not planning to cover that up much at all.
Right.
I'm going to put just a little tiny bit of maybe a black wash and some streaking coming down from those. But for the most part, what you see is what you get.
Exactly.
And I like these spaces. As much as I wouldn't want to walk up there,
no,
I sure like looking back in there and taking some pictures.
Right.
And just imagining crews having to go in here and work back in these spaces.
Right. I hope they're young and agile.
And with that, other than a little final weathering, the back and the 2 sides are finished.
Right.
It's just a matter now of putting the front on here. And I'm sort of thinking that the front might end up being as much work as the back.
I think so.
because there's all this mechanism, and in this case, I want it to be fully functional.
Oh boy.
Because the big chute here that they raise and lower, when it's in the down position, the locomotive will run into it.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't want to model it with the thing up all the time. I
No.
want to be able to have it down for photographs and stuff. So the only workaround there is it's got to be able to go up and down,
Right.
just like the prototype one does.
Exactly.
And while I'm at it, I may as well make the what would you call it here? The door, the bucket opening thing deal.
I don't know, the clamshell.
Clamshell, I like that.
I think it looks like a clamshell.
How about the thingamabob that
Yeah.
opens and lets coal out?
The gizmo.
But there's quite a bit of mechanism to this thing, and I want all the chains and everything to work just like they do right there on the prototype.
There you go.
Fortunately, I've had 4 years to gather up parts and try to figure out how we're going to go about doing this.
And visiting the actual tower. And
Yeah, because without the actual visit there, I would have no idea how to do this.
Me either.
And we hope you're going to want to follow along with this. So if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe. And the easy way to subscribe is by clicking on the upcoming
Count your
blue
fingers when you're
button.
done.
Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We sure hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
If y'all will go around this way,